Dear ladies and gentlemen, may I inaugurate our today's session on issues of education and economic growth. So let me introduce our today's speakers. So I am Sergey Sinelnikov, the Chancellor of the All-Russian Academy of Foreign Trade. Our speakers include Tatyana Klyachko and also Marina Borovskaya, Deputy Ministry of Science and Higher Education. Sorry for mispronouncing your name. Yes. I know you are no longer our subordinate. Alexander Brichkin, Head of Russian Science Book. Yaroslav Kuzminov, Chancellor of the High School of Economics. So Vladimir Mao, the Chancellor of RANEPA, left us. Victor Sadovnichi is being delayed at the moment, so he confirmed his visit earlier at the moment. And Andrei Fursenko was also summoned to some senior officials, and he will not be able to attend. So let's begin. Sergei Kravtsov, I didn't introduce him because you all know him well. So the head of the Federal Service for regulation in the area of education and science. So issues of education have been discussed often and a lot because in every family we have either educators or people who are studying at the moment. So we have little families who are not involved in the topic. So development of the education is being analyzed. So we analyze international experience, we build models, and it's clear that developing education is about investment in the human capital, and all depends on that, developing the social area and economics development. But the correlation between the two ratios is something that needs investigation. So this time we tried to mainly focus on the issues on how we can link economic development with parameters which are in the hands of regulation authorities. How can we coordinate our policy in education to ensure economic growth? So we tried to begin a survey 1 year ago, and we have a report we prepared for the forum, which is available at the website and which is distributed among our audience. But Tatyana Klyachko will be able to comment on the main items in the report. Thank you, dear Sergey. So, colleagues, good morning. So it's a really big topic and we are pressed by time, so I will have to skip some points and I will try to refer to some items of the report which is available here. So as Sergey Germanovich mentioned, it's available at the website and you also have some hard copies here. So you see the brief content of the report, and we reviewed a lot of models of economic growth which have to lead to an education system focused on human capital. And most of people who are present here, they realize that education is really important, that we need to accumulate human capital, and that it is to some extent related to the economic growth. And we need to tell between industrialized and developing countries. If we look closer into the models, and we head into the models of Hanushik, Lee, and Romer, and Breuer, and there is a huge list of references and I would like to tell you that we see differences between industrialized and developing countries. For developing countries, the coverage and the proliferation of secondary education is important. And empiric models say that when you broaden coverage by secondary education in developing countries, so that has a positive influence on the economic growth. But for industrialized countries, the number of students per professor is important, because the main point is the quality of education. If in an industrialized country, if it starts importing technologies, it's very important for this country to grow the number of students in engineering and technical areas, because these people provide for borrowing technologies and support development of technologies in certain historical conditions. So the number and the share of professionals involved in research and development is important, because these industries support development of the economics and the society. So accordingly, the number of registered patents is important, because this is the result, the output of what's going on in research and development. I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that the link between education and the growth of human capital. So what's difficult about it? If you keep accumulating human capital, and if you lack relevant economic conditions, so if you expand the coverage and if you grow the quality of education, you can get a substantial brain drain. And thus, development of human capital should be reconciled with the development of the economy, providing enough labor for educated young people. And you see how development of the R&D sector is going on in various countries, which are responsible for innovations today. Only in case of Russia, the number of research works kept dropping, and hence we need to pay special attention to that. If we need enough professionals for innovations, R&D sector has to develop proactively. And in recent years, we had serious brain drain among young scientists, and although now we see a growing number of young people, of young scientists join the sector, we lack the number of young researchers which would support the process. So you see the growth rate in industrialized and developing countries, and below you see the average growth speed in the period of 2002 to 2012, and you see that the developing countries are growing quickly, but they depend on the competitive environment. And in industrialized countries like EU, the growth rate is 2 to 3%. So the question on how you provide for the economic growth is an important one. And accumulating human capital and directing it to relevant areas is something what is really interesting for education policy. Now, I would like to touch upon briefly mentioning the international experience, because we are integrated in the world system, and you see that the coverage by higher education in the world is such that in Russia is in the main trend, but you see that in countries like the United States of America or the Netherlands and Norway, Norway is the first country in terms of human capital development and Dini, you see a slight drop of secondary education graduates into higher education. So it has to do with the growth of uncertainty, which are reported in many economies. But higher education has become something normal for most of the countries. At the same time, what's important for Oecd, you see the relation between higher education and the cultural level in the families. In the families where at least one of the parents has higher education, so in such families, a child would normally also get a higher education. So the chance for a family to educate one of the children up to the level of higher education is 70%. But for families where none of the parents has secondary education, the chance for a child to get a higher education is less than 25%. And that's important. When we are trying to strive for equality, we often ignore that despite all efforts, and you see a lengthy period of time, that the output of this equality policy is not enough. So this is a slide we can skip on how the employment policy changes. And now I would like to tell about what makes us most concerned here in Russia. So we looked into the average number of years the employed population is educated for the period of 2005 to 2017. So it's a period of approximation for the human capital. And you see that judging by that, the human capital in Russia is demonstrating a steady growth, and it reached 12.7 years by 2012. But if we would look into the areas where this human capital is needed, so we see that this is mainly IT and communication area and finance and insurance area. And judging by the average education years, so these two areas are where the human capital is the most needed. But in the social area, education, culture, science, there is still a high level of human capital, above the average. Also in the area of public administration, these audience is quite educated, and the question of how can we ensure efficiency of public administration. So this is something quite topical, because there is a high room for improvement. If we would talk about Russian regions, we also focused on the average education years for professionals in the regions. So as for the regions, the leading one is the Central Federal District, with Moscow attracting the most educated class, and also the northwestern region, where a lot is linked to St. Petersburg, and, well, sadly others. Siberian Federal District is doing quite poorly, and you also see some other constituents of the Russian federations, which, according to Human and Innovations report issued by the government of the Russian Federation, so are seen as regions with medium and low level of human development. So the constituents of the Russian Federation, which are considered to have a high level of human development, normally have high human capital and a medium number of education years. But if you would look into the growth of the region, you would see that the trend is downward from 2012, and the growth is quite slow. And hence the question, how can we redirect and reshape this high human capital to arrive to the high speed of economic growth we need? So that's a good question. And this is another important slide to me. Why, you might ask? Well, we looked into the average salary of a professional, an employee with a higher education. So we took it for 100%, and we tried to correlate it with salaries of professionals with different educational level. And we saw a drop in 12 years for the employees with higher educations compared to other categories. So it dropped from nearly 68% to 60% for the medium level of professional educations. So for the beginning level, it dropped from 71% to 60%. So, and you see that Russian economy mainly employs professionals with higher education, offering them a relatively high salary. Now we would like to draw your attention to the need of institutional reforms in the area of education, because on development of the education itself, a lot depends in the area of human capital development and how this human capital will function in our economy. So it was not possible to cover it all, but the main points are budgetary flexibility, what's being discussed from 2012. Also, the main and the single state exam. So it's about the check fingers and the change in the mechanisms of budgetary funding of higher education, schools, and other educational organizations. If you look at the change of structure for education in the consolidated budget, you will see that in preschool education, the share of costs is growing, being relatively stable, and on average, 7 to 7.5% of course are spent on additional education. So for the secondary vocational education, it's not quite high, 6.5 to 7%, and in the higher education, the share of costs is going down considerably from 17.7% down to 15%, so 2.7% in 12 recent years, which is considerable. A lot is being said at the moment about the national project, and we try to look how it can change the situation with education funding.
You see here information for 2019, that 3.7% share in GDP. And if we continue this trend until 2024, we have 3.69, and in my view, it's insufficient for development of the education. And according to our calculation, we need to have 4.4 or 4.6% to make sure that our educational sector develops adequately and can prepare adequate personnel, adequate experts for the economy. This slide is also very interesting. In my view, we've polled teachers who teach 9th and 8th and 9th grades at school. So the question was how many pupils can't sufficiently understand the school curriculum fully, and 1/3 of teachers think that 10 to 15% of children can't get all the knowledge required by the school program. For the poll for the 10th, 11th grades, here the teachers were saying that those pupils who were not academically successful, they already left school, and here we need to talk about the high professional skills of the teachers, and we also need to think about the educational programs that we have for the schools and about the tools which can make sure that children in the 10th and 11th grades have more or less average adequate level of education. Next slide. Here we see the distribution of people between vocational and higher education. During the Soviet times, 7.5% of people who studied in the first class, they entered high educational institution, but now we have 8%. And it's actually a very good parameter, and this means that we have a lot of improvements. There is still some restructuring within the educational sector, but everything is fine. Now we have some transformations. Year 1995 here, 25.7%. Here, those who left the 9th grade, they went for vocational education and they turned into workers, and only 12 to 8% would turn into mid-level specialists. Now, only 11% of children who go to colleges, go to vocational institutions, and 31.6% go on to become mid-level specialists. And this means that the dynamic is very good. So the situation now is similar to what we have in OECD countries, where figures are very similar, and a lot of pupils continue to study in lyceums and gymnasiums. Around 6% there go for vocational training, and we have 11 as comparison. And it means that this transformation should show that we need to understand very well which kind of tools will be applicable for the secondary vocational education. We hear a lot that we need to have the uniform state exams to be introduced for the vocational education. But I think it's too early to talk about that, because if we don't have still all the problems solved with these pupils who go to the vocational education, we will have a lot of dissatisfaction from the parents, and we are not going to improve the quality of education for the vocational educational institutions. Next slide. Distribution of the admission statistics. So here we have some students with the higher points in the exams. Here we see students which chose the economical studies. So the second column, that's budget education, free provided by state education. And the third column, that's the paid places at the universities. So this slide is very important to understand. Let's also compare it with the next slide. This is a structure of distribution of different subjects in the OECD countries in comparison with Russia. So we also have enough students and graduates who are interested in studying business and management, 33.4%. Some people say that it's a lot, but if we compare this figure with developed countries, we see that they have a similar figure. But still, we have a big disbalance in the number of graduates from the medical institutes. The population in OECD countries is aging, so they definitely need more doctors, more medical staff. But yes, for Russia, this sector is still missing adequate number of graduates. So here, it's another sphere where we can improve efficiency of the educational system. Changing the mechanisms of the budget financing for universities. So we had a new system of the norms for providing budget places, free places for the students. But I think that we need some fine-tuning for this system. And as we discussed last year, we decided now to change something here. So for the leading universities, we will have financing according to the special norms, and because these universities, they have unique programs, and if they do something unique, they can't work according to the standardized programs. But if we are talking about universities which are not considered to be leading universities, so I think here it's okay to have norms per one student, but we need to apply this to variable costs, and there should be the cost estimate, because that's budget funds, and the system should work efficiently. When we are talking about non-state universities, here we also have specific norms per student, and they will also have some subsidies for fixed costs. Another important thing, some of the universities are very important for the economy of Russia, but but not many prospective students are interested in entering them, but still this university should develop, they should continue to exist. That's why we need to make some efforts and motivate people to enter such universities. And besides, we need to make sure that graduates of these universities can find employment. 42% of young people with some engineering diploma are thinking about changing their specialization. That's a great challenge for our educational system, and we need to understand that very well. Last topic, accreditation of universities. This is an issue which has been discussed a lot recently, and this is our proposal. You see it on the screen. So the leading universities should get accreditation without any time limits. They need to have the right to set their own standards. And they are the universities which define the trends for the system. Second, universities with beneficial credit history, they should get accreditation for 12 years. And all other universities with the bad credit history, they should be monitored at least once in 6 years. Besides, we need to maintain the rating of universities. We need to see whether certain institutions go up or down in the ratings, and this should be as something very important for us when we are making decisions about accreditations. Next thing, we need to change or possibly define the so-called set of subjects which will be monitored during the accreditation process. And besides, we need to have an open-end fund of assessment means which will be used for assessing skills of the students. So these are the main conclusions of my report. You can find more information if you get hold of the text of the full report. And I think that if we discussed all these issues openly, this will be very important, because that's something that the educational community should discuss. And as Sergey Germanovich said, we all of us, we are involved in the educational system to some extent. That's why the quality of the educational system, that's something which defines the economic development and which defines the development of the human capital of the country. Tatyana, thank you very much for your report. Before I move into questions, I have one comment. So there is a task to do something about the education. What do we need to do to achieve this goal? So possibly we look at empirical models, we look at the experience from other countries, we make some comparisons with Russia, and it turns out that this task is very difficult. That's what what's the conclusion I make from your report. Why is this task difficult? We can't understand what are the links, what are the interdependencies here. So in developed countries, the educational system is good because the countries are already economically dependent, or vice versa. So, of course, we need to have influence in both sides, and there is influence in both sides. Second thing, models of some international experience benchmarks. That's something which is an average. Yes, we can, of course, use such benchmarks and look at different parameters by groups, by professions, by sectors of economies. But does it help us a lot? Do we know a lot about the quality of education in those sectors, in those groups? Same can be said about many other things. There are a lot of errors in assessments. For example, if we don't know very much about educational system in a certain country, which we are trying to use as a benchmark. So in some countries, elites, they get great education in private schools, but all other people in the country, they do not get salary even after graduating. So if we go further into details, we understand these principles better. Of course, we need to understand the main developments for our institutions. We need to understand the possible benefits and disadvantages, but we don't quite understand whether we need to start from increasing the funds for the educational sector or from some other steps. The first question would be the following. So which stage, which level of the education should be the priority? The secondary education or the higher education, or maybe continuous education for those who have a job already? Or maybe the preschool years should be the priority for us. Yes, we do have some proofs that these years are very important for the future of the nation. Sergey, maybe you'd like to start? Thank you very much, dear colleagues. I'd like to say that I'm very grateful for this very valuable analytical report. It was very informative, and it can help us start thinking about some important strategical decisions. Of course, the detailed analysis of these data and conclusions are important. So I like to be very cautious with some of the conclusions of this report. I would say that we need some additional discussions about some of the conclusions. But in general, this report is very important, and I'd like to thank you very much for it. As for the human capital development, Yaroslav or Marina, maybe you would also comment on that later on, but I'll share my opinion about that as an expert. So my expert opinion is the following. Of course, educational system influences the human capital and the economy of the country. Of course, if we do not have a good educational system, we won't have good citizens in the country. We won't have good specialists, and without that, we won't have an efficient economy or an efficient state. We won't have any development. Some research by PIAC from 2014 and 2015, they say that if a person has finished a good school, a university, like Japan, for example, we see a good economic growth. And that's an answer to a question about priorities. I think that all the levels of education should be a priority. If we think only about preschool or nursery education or about secondary education, that's not adequate. Of course, we need to think about readjustment of resources depending on the gaps in funding, but we still need to prioritize all the levels of education. As for the opinion, and I would like to share an opinion as a person representing my institution. So, do we need to try to influence this share from GDP, as it was discussed in the report, 4 or 5%? Here, I think we need to think about institutional changes. So the main funds were provided in 2003, 2004. It was important that some institutional changes were affected as well. So we had great changes according to many parameters, PISA parameters, and so on, for a lot of Russian universities. So if it's just the funding and there are no additional transformations, I don't think it would change anything for the educational system. And the next thing, I personally think that for the educational system right now, to make it more efficient, we need the following things. And especially I'm going to focus on the higher education, because you were talking about the unlimited accreditation, right? And a lot of people now confuse the accreditation and rating of universities. Accreditations, that's the compliance with parameters, with standards. So if standards are changing, the programs will be changing as well. What do we lack in the educational system right now? And that's a very important question. We lack an objective assessment system for all the levels of the educational system, for the school children, for the teachers, for principals of schools, for students who are taking exams, for rectors of deans of the universities, for university professors. We shouldn't just be answering the question, is this teacher or professor good or bad? We need to undergo such an assessment in order to support those who lack something. And this will change a lot. And a very brief example I'd like to share with you. In 2012, in Dagestan, for the Russian language, the results of uniform state exam was 73%, and next year it reached almost 100%. It reached much higher grades. So as the number of people, the results actually dropped significantly because the system of assessment changed and the assessment became very objective. What's the main problem for the secondary education? A lot of people are interested in vocational education because after finishing a college, you can enter university without the uniform state exam. What are the mechanisms of assessing graduates of the colleges? We talk a lot about standards, but we're not sure that this procedure is an objective one.
An objective procedure in assessment of students in higher education establishments. So it's a question. So when we are talking today about different solutions, so many solutions are linked to standards as discussed with Marina. So if standards say that special professional establishments needs a stadium, then that's the case. But how standards influence the quality of education? So let's improve our standards then, and the system will develop then. But the objective assessment and honesty and transparency when you work with the results. So this is the only case how you can get to a new level of efficiency in education. And of course, then it will translate into the efficiency of the economics, of the national economy growth and the human capital development. Thank you, Sergey. Yaroslav, over to you, please. So Tatyana offered us a very profound and interesting report, and really questions you touched upon, Sergey, so they are really wide in scope. So what are we likely to do in a situation like the one we have in Russia today? We have a really broad education, the coverage of the population is wide, and we have two sectors with relatively low coverage, which is below our best competitors and average competitors. So this is educating children in early age, in preschool age, from the age of 3 to 4, where we have a big gap, and also education of adult professionals. Only 15% in our case are continuing their education, while in industrialized country the average rate is 40%, and in Sweden it's 60%. That's an indicator that we need programs to bridge the two gaps I mentioned. So, about the growth of education, how can it be linked to the economic growth? Of course, we have a number of dimensions, but they are all relative, and I think everyone here and among our audience understands that education is just one of the factors. When a person needs to get hired, to get employed, when he is recognized in the economy that he deserves a salary, then this is how we get our human capital. So if the demand cannot be met, then we are talking about costs which do not contribute to the economic growth. So do we have a lot of costs like that? Yes, of course we have some, like all other countries. Of course, we are not a country somewhere in the tropics where you have the upper class, which is educated at the expense of the taxpayers which try to leave the country. So this is not the case in Russia. Well, we have a brain drain, but it's not as high given all the threats we are discussing. So because we lack labor resources, and one of the key problems for our economy as applied to the education is a very high share of economic unsuccessfulness. We have 20 to 25% of employed population which earn less than the society spends on them, and that can be compared to Brazil, China and India. So, but those countries have a lot of labor resources. They can afford to have some share of their populations in the slum. But in our economy, we really lack labor resources. And we have to attract millions of people from neighboring countries and countries that are far away, and that entails social risks for us. And the key problem for the contribution of education into the economy is reducing that percentage of unsuccessful people, and that heavily correlates with indicators Tatyana presented to us. According to PISA, Program for International Student Assessment, 25% of our employed people are unsuccessful. So at least in one discipline, and 14% are unsuccessful in 2 or more disciplines. So the correlations is really strong, and we need to cope with that. Anyway, so to me, the main question is worded by Sergey. I would like to reword it like this. Of course, we need to invest funds in areas where we have institutional transformations, but in some sectors, investment is likely to work without any serious structural or institutional sectors. Do we have any sectors like this in education? I need to be honest, I believe there are some sectors like this, and insufficient funding by 0.5% of GDP has to do with these sectors. So, first of all, research in universities. If we would look into funding of our higher education at the parity of purchasing power as compared to Europe, we will see that about 80% of our students are being funded in education, which is not that bad, and less than 10% of research per student. So our higher education schools are underfunded in R&D, but universities must raise innovative people. So if we would add to the existing research teams, if we would give them some extra funds, it would be a high contribution. The second point is the load on our educationalists. So the low quality of education has to a large extent to do with the very high load on school and university teachers. So the distribution of the check numbers is interesting. We have about 30% of educational programs where higher education schools have less than 25% of state paid vacation. So in areas like physics or different, so it's just one student groups, and we tried to raise this efficiency, this ratio of professor to student to one per 11 or 12. So no matter how the university would fund it, from the budget or from private money, would it be possible for 2 professors to support education in a university for a year? And we can see, and you can log on to whatever website you want, you have a list of professors. So a professor delivers a course in 5 to 6 disciplines, but it's not possible. A person must lead some research work. Well, it's like in elementary school. In elementary school, it's more about behavior. So this is a problem for both secondary schools and higher school establishments. So this is one of the areas where we can improve without any investment. About contribution of the education to the human capital. To me, the situation is like this. So the closer is the effect, the less is the contribution. If we would look into the short-term programs of additional education, so and according to my calculations, the contribution is of 0.1 to 0.15%, and the effect is likely to take 1 to 2 years. And in the secondary vocational education, so the correlation is 0.2 to 0.3 percentage of the GDP, and the lag is 2 to 5 years. So if we would look into the secondary school, the lag is higher. It's of 10 to 15 years. But the effect may be up to 1% of GDP. So we will double the current growth rate, because the secondary school is the precondition for these unsuccessful people, for raising people without any analytical skills, who would fail his math exams, and because nobody takes care of him. And the most profound effect with the 20 years lag is the psychological assistance to young parents. So the so-called psychological and teaching follow-up. So in our case, it has a lot to do with the drawbacks on how we raise our small children. So many things which start to hinder later on, so they accumulate in those early years. We don't have a program like this. So we have just some very symbolic funding of a billion or 1.5 billion rubles per year. So we can just create some kind of enlightenment system, but not any follow-up system. Thank you. Thank you. It was very interesting. So, Vladimir, our host, I would like to ask you a question, trying to be a little bit more specific. So, here in RANEPA, we have students and a lot of additional education. So would you please focus on how can we improve given those proportions? So that additional education for adults. Thank you. So our research show the same estimates like Yaroslav mentioned for additional educations. So the contribution is quite quick, but not serious. And in preschool education, so it's a substantial contribution, but in the long run. So in politics, the short-term impact is relevant, because otherwise the next generation of politicians and managers will reap the fruits. I would also like to tell you that we are in the very beginning of our research, and there is also a dependence that this influence on the growth, well, it depends on the development level of the country or the region. If you would try to benchmark, well, it's a more difficult question whether higher school establishments can offer competent human resources to the economy. So if you have a region with rapid development of the research education, not just the higher education, but the research education. It contributes to the development of the region of the country due to some objective reasons. If you would compare the United States of America, for instance, the representative of the Senate's committee from the Massachusetts state, so he would give some figures on how he will encourage education development in his own state, trying to encourage competition with California. So, but if you would invest into research education in Iowa or Missouri, the higher educated professionals are likely to leave the state. So you need to focus on lag factors and on the regional or national development. And in line with that, and you might criticize me, I mentioned it at East Russia Forum. So a wonderful research university in the Far East, well, is likely to encourage that brain drain. That's the question about whether the economy needs these human resources. So this is a challenging situation, but we need to pay attention to that. And if I have some more time, of course, education and development is a provocative topic. So it's rather about whether education should support economic growth. No, I don't think education is valuable as such. Well, of course, its influence on the economic development is important, but it's not about whether we should fund education as such. It should not be measured by its contribution into economic growth, because education, well, and anyway, you cannot even measure it with the happiness index, because my impression is that the better educated people are less happy, and all regional or international happiness indicators, they don't correlate well with the level of education in a certain region. And of course, you have a well-known formula. A lot of knowledge means a lot of misery. But of course, education is a factor for sustainability, for long-term challenges. You don't know what effects it may bring upon and when. So when Gutenberg invented the press, at first a lot of clergy were critical, and they doubted it was right in the long run. So because at the end of the day, many political regimes crumbled, although it happened in a century after, and later on the Bible was printed for some reason, and people started to read it. And that was even more harmful. What about the Constitution? Well, not yet. Don't worry. But provocative how this topic may seem. Of course, theoretically, it is interesting. But practically, you should know that education is important without any correlation on how it influences economic growth. Thank you. Vladimir, I have a question to you. I would like to focus it. So when we were talking about additional professional education, Vladimir, you are head of a wonderful engineering university, and you are also a deputy chairman of the Higher Accreditation Commission. And I would agree that when we are talking about education, growth is not the most important thing. But anyway, based on the model, so when you educate engineering, it is important for the countries which are trying to bridge the gap, because they import technologies. Educating researchers is important for industrialized countries because they create innovations. So in 2000s, we kept hearing that we educate a lot of lawyers and economists, but we need to train engineers. But again, there is a gap between Technological and Innovation Center. Well, you can mention other topics, but I would encourage you to focus on that. Thank you. Without any agreement with Vladimir, I fully share his point about economics, because higher education is about personal development, about raising a competitive individual. And if a mission of a university or an establishment of an extra vocational education, so if its mission includes profit or something related with money, so that has nothing to do with education. Regarding the technical or engineering area, as Tatyana showed us that statement about a growth of 5 to 6% in developing countries and a growth of 2 to 3% in industrialized countries. So then Russia should be an industrialized country. Well, that's a consolation for us. Yes, absolutely. So we need to look into what group we belong to. So Tatyana, you said some scary words about the case if we educate competent researchers, that might lead to a drain of competent professionals. So, but I think it's not the case. I would judge based upon my university and other universities I know, and we had some surveys about brain drain and mobility and circulations. And when we would talk about innovations and science, science knows no boundaries in today's world, and it's quite normal when researchers and innovators travel around the world and to get various competencies. It's quite normal. Sorry, in our university we have a Harvard professor, and she's honest. Yes, so I will spend 3 to 5 years at your place, and then I will move ahead. I need to produce a cell before, so she did some research in Germany. So answering your question, we need different type of researchers, and I fully oppose the situation when we try to link our education of engineering and technical professioning with how we educate users of different technologies. So if we try to train some users, then we are not talking about any progress in case of Russia. But anyway, we need both type of professionals. People who would focus on research, innovation, will promote technologies. And believe me, we have a lot of people like this in Russia. And if you would look into 5 to 100 program, we have a big movement in Russia, but we need people to operate and use technologies. So globalization is still in place. So we need different sort of folks. And as for developing countries, as we discussed with Vladimir, with that comparison, yes, so when the upper class is educated to the money of the taxpayers, and the rest of people are without pants, yes, Vladimir said it's clear because they have a relatively hot climate. Okay, so let's be based on that. Thank you. Vladimir, thank you. Marina, would you like to extend on that? Thank you. I'm really pleased. Yes, so because I'm at a loss between my two conditions as the former chancellor of a university who understands all the problems of the education, and my current status of a public official in the new Ministry of Science and Higher Education. And of course, here we're talking about the case that when we established the new Ministry of Science and Education, so we understood that the economic growth of the country has to do with the developing strong science, which should absolutely be based on strong education. And this current project of uniting research, based on strengthening research and creating a strong system of education, allows us to believe that that will bring upon the economic growth of our country. So the previous project of national education being carried out from 2005-2006 allowed us to strengthen our higher education system in the territory of the entire Russian Federation. So we have a strong network of federal universities and national research universities and supporting universities. And this network allows us to understand that by strengthening university infrastructure, and university infrastructure today is not just defined by material and technical resources, but apart from that, by IT resources for strengthening, also the financial resources accumulated in the universities, and of course the quality of professional community, the faculty, and the scientific capacity, which is part of infrastructure in certain universities.
And here I'd like to stress this fact, the quality of the infrastructure that we've created. This is something we define in the school, but defined by the school level education, because the quality of the professional community which we have at certain universities, at certain scientific institutions, that's something that defines the success of transformation and the achievement of goals of certain universities. Economic development of a country is linked to welfare of every citizen, and welfare of citizens of the country is linked with the quality of the education. And this national project related to education, this was the period when we realized that the state is ready to invest in every citizen with a view of the economic development, economic growth. And here we, of course, remember about companies who want to have skilled professionals. And we also know that parents want to have highly educated and successful children. The task of universities is to increase and improve infrastructure, improve the faculty, and at the same time they want to have this great resource. I mean, a wonderful infrastructure and good students who are skilled and who can ensure the success of the educational programs of certain universities, which will be later on transformed into the economic flourishing of the country. I have a presentation, and I'd like to share some information about our national projects. Right now, we have a number of national educational projects which have these two main ideas as a priority. First of all, the development of a person, development of welfare of every citizen of the country, and we do a lot to achieve that. I mean, us as the educators, those who work with the educational system, because if we provide good education, will ensure the development of a person. And second thing, that's the success of an employer. We need to create and strengthen our infrastructure. We need to have a great and strong professional community, and we hope that more students will want to be the part of this community if they see the successful people as part of the faculty. Of course, we understand that this will define the success of our higher educational system. If we are talking about being an employer for ourselves, and we actually employ 25% of all the graduates, and this is a significant amount of graduates, so that's why, of course, we need to make sure that these graduates have great skill, have great qualifications, so that in the future the economy is successful. Of course, the state, so we have at the state level 3 levels for decision making. So first of all, this is the state management, the governmental management. So here we're talking about the licensing for the educational institutions, because the state is interested in having these licenses. We are talking about the consolidations of group of professions. And of course, accreditation is an important topic. We also know that accreditation is at the decision-making level of a dean, because accreditation is usually provided for certain educational programs, and if the professional community of a certain university didn't provide the support for such an educational program, so they're not acknowledged at a sufficient level, maybe the head of the university should understand that this program is not in line with the standards. Maybe if you carry on with this program, it will make the university unstable to some point. So I think that this is the task of a state. A state will create some regulatory bodies, and the system of these bodies will create the corporation of users of the companies who will employ the graduates. They will also have their own requirements for such graduates. And additional level, that's scientific education, institutional. And here we need to decide what kind of percentage of graduates will be hired for the faculty, who will go for R&D work, and who will be employed by the businesses. How many young graduates will continue studying, and how many people will be sent to the partner universities as part of the mobility programs, because it can help to improve the qualifications of the faculty when these students will come back after the exchange programs. That's now we have the decree 2018. This helps us to assess the skills within the university. We find a partner, and we prepare the graduates for a certain partner, for a certain business. We send such graduates after they finish graduate from the university. And we have additional decree according to which we prepare a certain number of research specialists. So we have the program of preparing research specialists for certain research institutes. Specific engineering centers that also have some requirements for the graduates, and which who employ a certain share of such graduates. The number of people who get education in universities, that's something that the people who are going to teach those who are preschoolers now. So all of this is interrelated, and when we perform such a transformations, we lay foundation for the future. And we need already now think about the programs for the school children, preschoolers, because they are going to enter universities at a later stage. And the heads of universities, they should be in the dialogue with the government, because the government and the university have mutual goals. So now I'm going to talk about some national educational projects that we I'll highlight some of the important points related to these projects. And you can get the full text of this presentation. That's just the first draft of this presentation. We can continue the discussion. The Ministry of Education, the Ministry, the other relevant ministries participated in developing of these projects. A national project Science, national project Education, and partially we participated in the national project Digital Economy. These projects are related to the federal projects, the whole set of them, which will be implemented, and we are going to participate in that. First of all, we've set a parameter which will define the efficiency of the program, which is linked to the social and economic regional development. We want to make sure that university and the regions where the universities are based, they have the possibilities to find employment for the graduates. So we need to make sure that every region thinks about this problem of retaining the specialists. And this is related to the social goals, related to the social and economic development of a region. So, of course, we are interested in preparing qualified specialists, but we also need to have partners within the regions which will become employers for them. And I'm sure that it's very important that universities cooperate with heads of regions. Here we have the target, and Russia is actually takes the 17th place in the top 500 of the global universities, and our goal is to improve our position. That's a great goal for us. We have 11 federal projects right now, and the Ministry of Science and Education, together with HSE, participates in 3 of them: improving competitiveness, creating equal opportunities for everyone, and the third one. I can't go into all the details about every federal project, but you'll have the full text of it. I just wanted to comment that I think that every university, every educational institution should find some parts of these projects which they can actively support. If we are talking about economic development and improving welfare of citizens, of course, the requirements to the skills of graduates is growing exponentially, and we need to follow the trend. But right now, the system is unfortunately not within the overall high educational programs, but we want it to be integrated. So we are thinking about developing life learning education, scientific institutions, and by 2024 we are going to employ thousands of young research specialists in our research institutions. This will change the approach to scientific research. That's why I think that that's great if we have this cooperation between these two parties. Life learning education. So here we have the federal project New Opportunities for Everyone. We hope that 3.5 million citizens will be able to change the status, educational status, get some additional education within the scope of this project. We are talking about people of different ages, and we think that all these people can change their status, and this will lead to improving the welfare and improving the living standard of them. Expert of education, that's another federal project. Here we want to engage as many young people as possible, and it's something that we've been doing for the last 5 years, and we see that universities are interested in and actively participate. We have more students coming from abroad, but of course we want to have only the most talented young people to come to Russia. And this is something which we need to actively influence ourselves. So we organize university competitions. We want to select best of the best and to attract them to become students in our universities. Next national project, science. We can employ a lot of research specialists ourselves. A lot of people, of course, will go to corporations, to different business sectors, especially applied sectors. But I also think that fundamental science is something we need to develop actively, and we need fresh, talented blood. We need new people, research specialists here. Federal project development of scientific cooperation. We have major regional partners. That's something that the government is very interested in.
I do hope that this will also become a point for your interest. I think I've covered all the key aspects that we would like you to take into consideration. Thank you very much indeed. Marina, thanks a lot. We have literally a few minutes, like 2 or 3 minutes left. Mr. Horvai, floor is yours, please. Microphone, please.
To development, which is already the plan to expand it to the 0-3 age group. The second one is reducing inequities in education. The third one is focusing more on socio-emotional skills. And the fourth one is providing conditions in the economy that reward higher skills. So I'm going to elaborate a little more. I will do a turn. I talk a little bit about the Human Capital Index and then come back to these 4 points. So last October, the World Bank launched the Human Capital Index, and what I want to speak about is not so much about the index, but the reason why this index was created. So the first one is that we did a report a year ago on the changing wealth of nations, and that report showed that 2/3 of the wealth of nations globally is embedded in human capital. It's the first time, actually, we have quantified human capital's contribution to the wealth of nations. The second one, this is compared to natural resource wealth and built capital. The second one is that we have carried out extensive research on return on education. And what we found in one conclusion is that every addition of 1 year of schooling globally means 9% more income for the individual. Of course, this differs across countries, but that's the global average. And then the third one is that we had a major report on the status of learning in the world. And we found that despite the fact that there has been a fantastic increase in enrollment of students, especially in developing countries and especially of girls, the fact that there are more students in school doesn't mean that there is more learning. So there is actually a learning crisis across the world. And yet governments don't really focus on human capital and education. So next slide, please. So we created this index. I'm not going to get into any of that. The most important point here that this index is forward-looking, and every component of it is related to productivity. The next slide. This shows the components of the index. Here, the most important point is that it looks at the productivity potential of a person born today at the age of 18. So what is the percentage of the total potential a person has in terms of full productivity? Next slide. So this is the result. So worldwide, this is the global result. It's very interesting. So the blue is the good thing. So that shows that there's high human capital index, high potential. And then the reddish ones are the ones, the countries where it's low. But the most striking one is that 56% of children live in countries where their potential for productivity would be only half of what it could be at full health and complete education. Next slide, please. So this shows where Russia stands. So Russia is at the level of high-income countries, and it's above the level of Europe and Central Asia. Next slide. So where Russia really excels is education, right? So the problem is in life expectancy and health, but in terms of education, this is harmonized, 3 different international assessments harmonized into one. And Russia is among the top 10 countries in the world in terms of harmonized learning outcomes. So there's a lot to be proud of. Next one. Let me skip this. This just shows that schooling is not always learning. So there's a difference between time spent in school and learning, and so that we make an adjustment which is called learning adjusted schooling years. So the next one is, oops, so which is the next one? Oh, more. All right. Okay, let's go further. So I want to come to Russia specific. Next one. Okay, so this is Russia. Russia is so a child born today at the age of 18 will have 73% of the full potential in terms of its productivity. So the list is led by Singapore with 88% in total, and you can see that Russia is doing very well on under 5 mortality and schooling and education, less on health. Next one. So I'm coming now to the more Russia-specific findings, which are outside the Human Capital Index. This just shows the tremendous diversity in educational outcomes across regions. So that's the point on equity. But the next slide is going to show the result in terms of the harmonized learning outcomes. And this is by gender, by rural, urban, and by socioeconomic status. And what you see at the bottom, and this is the most important point in terms of inequality, is that there is about 2 years of learning difference between the richest and the poorest. And this is where the equity point comes in. Improving the learning outcome of students that are coming from the lower income families will make a huge difference in the total learning outcome and also in terms of economic growth. We just published a report on education equity, which actually puts some numbers on this. If you improve the lower part, what happens to economic growth? Next slide. So this is about socioeconomic skills and problem solving in particular. So this is collaborative problem solving on the right, and that's actually a very interesting one. So Russia is doing extremely well on PISA. It's at OECD levels on math and reading, less good on science. But what you see here, the red line is the -22 among all countries in the PISA assessment. The largest difference is in Russia in terms of collaborative problem solving and the results in math and education and science. So that's a sign. This is where the focus needs to be. And early childhood development is a very important equalizer, both in terms of economic inequalities, but also in developing socioeconomic skills. So on the left-hand side, what you see is how at early age, how early childhood development can influence socio-emotional skills. And then the final point, and I think that was made by Tatyana, also by Yaroslav Kuzminov and Vladimir Mao, that you have to have the demand side. So you can have the brightest of people educated, but if this is not rewarded by the economy, by higher salaries, and by innovation, that there is no environment for innovation that channels this knowledge into higher total factor productivity and economic growth, that education is lost, that knowledge is lost. So there are 2 points here I want to make. One is that our research shows that between 1994 and 2014, the income of those with higher skills increased much less than with those with lower skills in the Russian Federation. So this was very good for inequality because it reduced income inequality, but it was not good for rewarding higher skills. The second point is that Russia, companies in Russia, only 1 out of 10 report on innovation. In OECD, it's about 30 to 40 or 30 to 40%. And Russia spends a little more than 1% on R&D as against China that spends 2%, or Germany that spends 3%, or Korea or Israel that spend over 4%. So if you don't have enough innovation, if you don't have enough recognition of higher skills, then this transmission to higher economic growth is not going to happen. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое. Уважаемые коллеги, к сожалению, я получил...
Thank you very much, distinguished colleagues. Unfortunately, I'm instructed to leave the room. Unfortunately, I'm not able to give the floor to everybody on the panel. But I think we've managed to cover this issue from different angles, so thank you very much indeed.